Hebrews chapter 7. And Johnny also asked me to mention that Lee Gatling, he was going to say it in the announcements, and you know how it goes sometimes, I forget things too. Lee Gatling is in Good Shepherd Hospital. He has a pretty serious jaw infection. In fact, they were going to, at first they thought they were going to operate on it, but then I guess the medicines they were giving him caused the swelling to go down, and he says he's feeling some better, but they're trying to get the swelling to go away and the infection to go away. And so please keep Lee Gatling in your prayers. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm not sure where it came from. It could have been from a tooth, yeah. But just he sent me a picture and his face was just swollen.
Everywhere you look, he's got a problem.
He's pretty bad. Yes.
He needs our prayer.
He needs our prayers, that's right. So. All right, if you open up to Hebrews chapter 7, we're going to be working our way through that today. And so we've gone through the first six chapters and kind of looking at, the Messiah is both man and God. And so far we've kind of covered he's the greater lawgiver, greater than Moses even, and that he is the greater high priest, higher than Aaron. And once we get into chapter 7, we're going to be looking specifically that he has the greater covenant. If you compare the old and the new, chapter 7 is going to begin to prove that Jesus has the greater covenant. And so, but it starts in the first 3 verses of chapter 7, and it's going to answer the question, who is Melchizedek? And why does that really matter when we talk about Jesus? And so it says in chapter 7 and verse 1, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And so Melchizedek, his name, means king of righteousness in the original language. And then king of Salem, well, that's what eventually becomes Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Salem is very similar to the word shalom. And so it's the idea of he's the king of peace. They're described. And that's what he says in verse 2. He says, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. And so he's the king of righteousness. He's the king of peace. You can kind of think about Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6 when talking about Jesus, not Melchizedek, but talking about Jesus. It calls him, wonderful counselor, mighty God, Prince of Peace. That this is Melchizedek is the type that moving forward, Christ becomes the antitype of King of Righteousness and Peace. Yes, ma'am.
I'm about to get confused on how to ask this because my mind switched on me. But Melchizedek why is he so important that he's compared to Christ and David?
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is he's explaining that for us. So stick with us and we're going to see it come out. Yes, ma'am. But that's so, and just as a reminder, right? We saw Melchizedek for the first time in Genesis chapter 14 when it described, Abraham had just won a great battle over the kings of the north. He had saved Lot and the people of Sodom. And now he's taken all that loot and he's giving a 10th of it to this priest, really giving it to God in a way of saying he knows God is the one who gave him this victory. And it describes that 10th part in verse 2 there that he offered to Melchizedek.
We're told very little about Melchizedek.
That's true.
He just all of a sudden pops up.
Yes.
He's a priest of God in the middle of a land that's an idolatrous land.
That's right. Yeah. And
where did he come from? But that also reassures for me that God's going to always make sure that someone
there's always
there
people. Yeah. And that's part of why God says, he tells Abraham, this land is not ready to be destroyed. And that's part of it. There are pockets of people who are clearly faithful to God, like Melchizedek, at this time. And so, but he's king, but then what makes him relevant, especially to Christ, is he's also priest, which is why Abraham can, offer the sacrifices to God through Melchizedek. He's also priest. And so Abraham gave to Melchizedek, he's really saying, in the same way that they would have given to Aaron or to the Levite, to the priesthood of Aaron in the Old Testament. Now,
someone to compare him though to Christ,
mm-hmm.
he has
He was the king and the priest. That's right. Yeah, he was judicially in charge of the nation or the city, and then religiously in charge of the city. And that's so. Then in chapter 5, it began to quote from Psalm 110 in verse 4, which is where God calls the Christ ahead of time, and he says, he swears, he says, I will not relent. You will be a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That just as Melchizedek was king and priest, Christ would be a king priest. That's the similarity there. Yeah. Now, verse 3, and verse 3 is very interesting. He says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now, I'll just start from the get-go, and I'll just tell you kind of my history with this verse, okay? I have history with this verse. So, no, I even before I was in preaching school, I became very interested in the book of Hebrews, and Sarah can attest to how many hours I spent one year just like trying to understand the book of Hebrews. And I had all these commentaries and things, and I was kind of trying to figure it out. And I was really interested in this because it sort of sounds like he's describing here that Melchizedek is an eternal person. It kind of sounds like it's saying he's a person who never died, who was never born, so forth and so on. Now, and I'll just say this too as a part of the comparison. It says without father and without mother that he was never born, but even Christ was born, you know. And so, but at any rate, it's describing this person as a priest, and it kind of sounds like he never lived. And so I was really interested in that, and so I dug really deep, and even before I went to preaching school, this is what I found. It says at the end of verse 3, he was made like the Son of God. When you look at that word for like, and there's several different words in Greek that you could choose to describe the word like, but they picked this particular word, and it literally just means he is similar to, or he is a type of. And so you will hear people teach that this is maybe like the pre-incarnate Christ, kind of like the angel of the Lord is, or something like that. And I will not argue with you if that's what you believe. But just in my own studies, and then even after going to preaching school and learning a little bit more how to study and kind of coming to that same conclusion, that it seems what the emphasis here is, right? There's no record of who his parents are, right? And Scripture doesn't give us a record, and in secular history, there's no record of who his parents are. There's no record of his genealogy. There's no record of when he died or when he didn't die. And so in that sense, as a type of Christ, his priesthood never ends because it's not recorded for us. Now, why is that important? All right, when we think about the context of the book of Hebrews, what is so important to say Melchizedek has no records of it ending? What are we contrasting in particular?
He didn't die.
All right, so Christ has no ending, but what Miss Lynn is saying. That's right. So we're contrasting with the Levitical priesthood, and we're saying, right, we know Aaron's genealogy from Moses. From Adam all the way down to Aaron, and then they had the records all the way down to the present time, right? From the beginning of the world to the moment that this book was being written, they had the records of who all those people were, how they were all related, who was the high priest, down to the minute of this writing, and then what happens to all of Aaron's records? The Romans destroyed all of the records, and so suddenly there's no way to know who can be the high priest in the Levitical priesthood, right? And so this is the contrast that's being made. We know the year that we know the age that Aaron was, the day that he died. That's written for us in the book of Numbers. It tells us exactly how old Aaron was when he died, right? We have all of these records about their priesthood, but Christ, now we know Christ's parents, but what is Christ's lineage as far as priesthood goes? His lineage is Judah. He has no lineage as far as priesthood goes, just like Melchizedek, right? His father was not a priest. His mother was not married to a priest. He doesn't have a priest genealogy. Christ also has no beginning of days or end of life when you think about him as God. Of course, as human, he has a birth and a death, but as he's not trying to be a priest as a priest on earth, right? He's a spiritual priesthood. And so he says he's made like the Son of God, and that in a sense he remains a priest continually, just as Jesus literally remains a priest continually. Carl.
I'm assuming, the Old Testament has types all through it.
Yes.
And there's a type for everything, and I'm assuming this was created, Melchizedek became a priest for the very purpose
Sure.
that he would be a type for Christ, and that he is this priest that we don't know where his temple was. We have no idea where where the worship took place. We have no. I mean, there is this. I do see the theory of him being the pre-incarnate Christ.
Sure.
I'm not saying I believe that, but I can see where the
Sure.
theory, where the theory can come from.
Yeah.
He, in the same way, the priesthood here, the Levitical priesthood, it was just for this earthly life, and it really had very little to do with the spiritual life of, or the spiritual going into, because the temple here on earth, and what was that was a type
Yeah.
of temple that is in heaven.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at these things that are going on in history and in heaven, the same of what's going on in heaven. There is I don't know what it, I have no idea what the temple in heaven is going to be like, or
Right.
what it is, but we do know who the high priest is.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's Christ Jesus.
That's Christ. Yeah, and that's certainly God knew before time began that a man named Melchizedek would be born who would be a type of Christ. And so this is the comparison that he's making.
Is there any other writings anywhere other than in the Bible that mention Melchizedek?
Not that I know of, no, that no like secular historical record of Melchizedek's life. Not that I know of. And so that's you don't anticipate really, maybe finding things with his name on it is possible, but you don't anticipate finding his genealogy, because this is, all true. And so, right. But he continues then in verse 4, right? And so he's gonna prove now how Melchizedek as a priest is greater than Aaron and Levi are, and kind of building to a point. And so he says, verse 4, now consider how great this man was, talking about Melchizedek. Consider how great he was, that even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. Right? Now, think about how important Melchizedek must be if the father of the Jewish nation, right, that he is the one that they turn to over and over again. They're like picture of what it means to be descended from Abraham. Even Abraham tithed to him, he says. Think about how important Melchizedek must be. And so verse 5, he explained that. He says, indeed, those who are the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. Right? And so in other words, he's saying, who did God elevate among all the 12 tribes? Who did God elevate to receive tithes from all the people? It's the Levites, and in particular the tribe, or the section of Aaron of that. But he says, the Levites were raised up, they were exalted, they were elevated because they were the only ones that stood with God at the golden calf incident. They were given that honor. Even though all of them are descended from Abraham, God still raised up one portion of them to receive tithes from everybody. And so they kind of understand this. He says in verse 6, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And so if the Levites were exalted over the other ones, but Abraham is giving tithes to this other man who is not a Levite, then how great must he be exalted up? And then at verse 7, he says, now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Okay. So, in other words, what he's describing here, right? Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and that's a second sign. Right? The first sign is he gave tithes to Melchizedek. The second sign that Melchizedek is greater is that Melchizedek did the blessing. Right? And this was this was a common understanding, and the best way I know to describe it is, who did the blessing at the end of life? The Father blessed the sons, or the sons blessed the Father? Right? The Father blessed the sons, and that's because the Father had the blessing to give. And so that's why they kind of considered that the Father was greater than the sons. He owned all the things and all the blessings. He passed them on to the sons at the end of life. And so in that sense, right, he's the superior. Right? He's the one in charge. He's the greater in that sense. And so and he says this is beyond all contradiction. If you lived in this time, this is something that nobody would argue. The one who does the blessing is considered higher in status than the one who receives the blessing. Now, this is interesting to me. When Jacob met Pharaoh, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Even Pharaoh recognized, because of Joseph, I think, Jacob was his superior in status. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, recognized Jacob being the father of Joseph. A man like Joseph was higher in status, and so he received a blessing from Jacob. I think that's interesting. But anyway, he continues in verse 8, and he says, here, mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. And so, right, now, Melchizedek represents the eternal priesthood, because there's no record of his death. And so in the one case, you have tithes that are received by mortal men, right? And when you think of the word mortal, what does that ultimately bring to mind for us? Your mortality, right? Death. And so he's using the Levitical priesthood to represent the fact that we die, that animals die because of our sins in the Old Testament, that when we break the law, death is what happens for the animals or for us, depending on the circumstances. In the other case, he says, by one whom it says he's testified that he lives, right? That's the fact that there's no record. And so it's the priesthood with no end. A priesthood with no end represents life, right? Or represents eternity. Yes.
So don't need a genealogy if your priest doesn't die. It's like if Aaron never died, they would never need to figure out who was next.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly it. You don't need a genealogy if your priest lives forever. And that's kind of, he's building to that point here. And so that's why verse 9, he says, even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham. Now he says, this is so to speak, right? Levi didn't literally do this. Levi was not born yet. But he says, so to speak, because, verse 10, he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And so it's just kind of the idea, right? If Abraham is greater than Levi, because Abraham is the father of Isaac, who's the father of Jacob, who's the father of Levi, right? When Levi was blessed, that originates with Abraham. And so it's just coming down to Levi from Abraham originally. And Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Then in that sense, Levi did too, because he was, as he says, still in the loins of Abraham at that point. And so therefore, if Abraham is greater than Levi, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, then there's no argument. Melchizedek and his priesthood is greater than Levi and his priesthood. And so he's just proving the point here that if you had to pick, I want to be under the priesthood of Levi, or I want to be under the priesthood of someone who's under the order of Melchizedek, there's an obvious choice. One, because Abraham paid tithes. Two, because Melchizedek blessed Abraham, proving Melchizedek is the greater. That's an obvious choice to make. Okay. Any thoughts or comments on what we've looked at? Yes, ma'am.
Just a question or a comment. I want to go back to verse 3.
Okay.
Of the specificity in that verse, saying without father, without mother, without genealogy, and neither beginning of days or end of life. If that be the case, and he's so very specific here in the way it's termed, why can't we take that at face value and think, God could do this?
Sure.
If he wanted to do this, he did it. And following your trail of thought and the study that you've put into it, I can see where you might think, you might think that or you believe that or something. But then there's this other side that's to me, that's all we're given here. We're not given much information. And so, and I agree with what Sarah said about not having an end, they live forever. So nobody else, could do that but Christ. And God created Christ.
Well, no, God didn't create Christ.
Well,
but I know what you
he's
mean.
part of it. You know
Yeah,
what I
yeah.
mean? Yeah. God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit
Yes.
are all one.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering why we don't take it at face
Yeah,
value.
and that's why I say, like, I'm not gonna argue with someone if that's
Right. I'm not arguing,
that's
I'm
perfectly fine. Yeah. For me, it's two things. It's the word like. He could have picked a word that says is, and he picked the word like, and I think it's important to ask why did he pick that particular word to say that he's similar to the Son, if he is in fact the Son, or something like that. And then the second is, if Melchizedek is still living and being the priest today, of what? What would he be the? Okay, yeah.
Is he still alive today somewhere?
Right. If he is, what is he the priest of today? Because his point in this section is the only priest we need today is Christ. And so if he's a priest continually, verse 3, if that's a literal thing, or if he, as he says in verse 8, witness that he's still living today, being a priest continually, what is he the priest of? And that's why I lean towards the idea that this is a picture of Christ and not a literal thing, because we don't need two priests. We really just need Christ. Yeah. I don't want to get real hung up on this. So if all the comments are about him being forever, that's why I said let's not argue about it. Is your comment about him being alive? Okay, all right. Not necessarily. We've got more
I was
things
going to say
to
the
do.
genealogy part of it. I mean, if he wasn't Christ, if he is the priest, if that's true, then they're one and the same.
That's fair.
That's not what I wanted to say.
That's fair, yeah.
In the genealogy part of it, especially early on, it was oral traditions.
Yes.
And so it didn't become a written record until much, much later.
Sure.
And that's where it was much harder to destroy these genealogies because of the oral traditions, because you didn't know who was keeping the oral, or outsiders didn't know who was keeping these oral traditions. You had to wipe out the entire
clan
to get the person. And there was usually more than one person.
Yes.
There was that was responsible for these oral traditions, and they memorized. I mean, this is a memorized thing that they did. They did every day. Every day they would recite this.
That's right.
These genealogies, and so that I think that's where it was much easier once it became a written record. We
To
did away
destroy
with
it. Yeah.
We did away with the oral traditions, and once it became a written record, God was able to destroy the written record, and there's no record
of it.
This section is written to make sure we understand, and that the ones of that day reading this, that Christ's priesthood is so much more important to us and them than the Levites' priesthood.
That's right. Yeah. And that is the big picture idea there. Yes.
I think Melchizedek's easier to understand. What do you think? He's not the only priest that was not a Levite that we read about in the Bible.
Yes.
It's like Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, was also a priest of God, even though he wasn't, like, it doesn't, and we don't know who his parents were either.
Right.
And so it's kind of that same, like, there were men here and there. Maybe Job might have been one of
Job
those.
is one of those, yeah.
That God picked to be his priest, and not because of who their dad was or whatever, but he was just like, I need somebody to do this job. You're the guy.
Yeah, and it was really the idea of the patriarchal age. She's talking about Melchizedek's not the only person like this. You have Job. He offered sacrifices for his sons every morning. You have Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. He's a Midianite, not a Levite, and we don't know who his parents are or who Job's parents are, but they're also priests like that, because that's, if you were the father, that's Abraham, really. Abraham is that for his family, and if you were the father, then you were the head of the home, and you were the priest for your family, and you offered sacrifices on their behalf. And so that's any father who was faithful to God was a priest like that. He happens to be the king of a city, and that's kind of what makes him distinct from maybe like Jethro, who maybe he's not the king of a city. But all right, we're going to go on then to verse 11. Okay, one more. See, we've not even got to the best parts of chapter 7 yet, is what I'm trying to say. So, no, go ahead.
I'm kind of like Sharon. I'm reading the Bible, and then I come to a word that says without father, without mother.
Mm-hmm.
But then you said something that was short and sweet, but then I'm thinking, yeah, you're probably right. I can't take this word literally without.
Right.
So say that one more time. Let that kind of soak into it.
Well, let me figure out which one it was. So,
Word like that you
is it talking about the word like? Is that what it is?
What did he say, Chad?
Like the Son of God.
Other
Yeah.
words, it made you think that he really had no record.
Yeah. So it's when he says in verse 3, he's made like the Son of God. There's a lot of words he could have chosen there. And a lot of people teach that this is the pre-incarnate Christ. So that, it would have been Christ who came and did this for a moment. And then, but the word like is a very specific word that means similar to. And he could have picked lots of words that mean the same as or is, but he picked the word like, which means similar to. And so that's one of the reasons why I lean towards the idea that there's just no record of his genealogy and that he's a type of Christ, because he seems to be a real person who is similar to Christ because he's both a king and a priest. And again, as Miss Lynn was pointing out, there's a contrast being made here of we don't know his genealogy and his mother and father, but we know it for Aaron and his family. And so he's contrasting them to say Christ also, there's no record of, we know his parents, but there's no record of a priesthood that he comes from, no record of a lineage of priests that he comes from, just as there's not from Melchizedek.
He had no offspring to hang
That we know of. Right? Yeah.
Was that word in the original translation, or has this been translated over the years? Is this
Oh, this is the word that's used in every translation that we have. There's no textual variance here, and so yeah, it's a consistent. Yeah, every translation we have uses the word like. That's a good question. Every manuscript, yes, sorry, every manuscript has this word. Yeah. So, all right, picking up in verse 11 then, and it's an interesting thing to think about, and I enjoy talking about it too. All right, verse 11. We're now that we understand that Melchizedek is so much greater than Levi, then he's moving on to say the evidence says we need a change in covenant. Right? So verse 11 he says, therefore, if perfection, right? That's the same word, if completion, if maturity, were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law. What further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek? In other words, if all God really wanted was the Levitical priesthood, if that was the maturest form of priesthood, then God would not have promised in Psalm 110 and verse 4 that there'd be a new priest according to the order of Melchizedek. In other words, he's saying, when the Jews read Psalm 110:4, it should have clicked. He's going to replace us someday. He's going to remove the Levitical priesthood for a new priesthood. And so he's saying that should have clicked for them. Verse 12, for the priesthood being changed, of necessity, there is also a change of the law. And that's verse 11. He said, for under it the people received the law. In other words, the law of Moses is intricately tied to the Levitical priesthood. You cannot be obedient to the law of Moses if you do not have a priesthood under Levi. You cannot be a priest of Levi if you are not obeying the law of Moses. They go hand in hand. And so when Psalm 110:4 promised a new priesthood, he's saying that the logical conclusion is what they should have understood is not just a new priesthood, but a new law. Because since they're so tied together, you can't break them apart and keep the law of Moses under a new priesthood. If you have a new priesthood, you've got to have a new law. So verse 13, he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no man has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning, and he's talking about earthly priesthood. And so in other words, he says, right, on earth, Jesus is not qualified to be a priest, and he never tried. You read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not once did Jesus ever go into the temple and try to do the job of a priest. Right? He doesn't want to be an earthly priest under Levi, and he's not qualified. He never could have been a priest under Levi. And that's he says, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing. What that means is, never once did Moses say, the tribe of Judah shall not be priests. Right? He never said those words. But just because he didn't write those words explicitly down doesn't mean that Judah was just allowed to do it, right? He's saying he specified what he did want. He wanted Levi, he wanted Aaron's sons to be priests. And so just by nature, that disqualified every person who wasn't a son of Aaron from ever being a priest. And so he says, right, and no one argued with that. They perfectly understood Jesus was not qualified to be a priest on earth. And yet, verse 15, it is far more evident if in the likeness of Melchizedek, there arises another priest who has come, not according to the law of a fleshly commanded, but according to the power of an endless life. And so, and he's saying it's far more evident, right? This should be perfectly obvious to us at this point. Remember what he said at the end of chapter 5? They should have been teaching this themselves. They could have figured this out on their own if they weren't dull of hearing. And so he's saying, now that I'm explaining it, it should be perfectly clear, especially because he's writing to Levites, right? He's writing to Jerusalem. He's writing to the people who lived this day in and day out, people who knew the law of Moses better than anyone. And he's saying, right, it should be perfectly evident to you. God said, I will raise up a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And so if there's another priest, he cannot be a priest over the law of a fleshly commandment. Right? What's the law of fleshly commandment? The law of Moses, right? Where they have to slaughter the flesh in order to sacrifice for sins. So he's calling it the law of fleshly commanded. It has to be according to the power of an endless life, right? It has to be a law that can actually save people forever, for eternity. It has to be a law that can actually be run by a priest who lives endlessly. For he testifies, right? And so he's re-showing us the proof. He's reminding us, you're a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, right? That word there in there, priest forever, an endless life. You don't have that under the law of Moses. And that's why he says in verse 18, for on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment. I love this verse because it makes it very plain. The former commandment, that's the law of Moses, he stamps it, annulled. Important, Romans 15:4, we learn from it, but do we obey it? Do we follow it? Annulled, no longer in effect. Yes?
I find it very interesting that a lot of people have a problem with the Old and New Law, the Old and New Testament. I mean, you don't find it anywhere else other than in Christianity.
Right.
Because, the United States had the Constitution we live by today. That's not our first Constitution. We had a Constitution before that.
Right.
Articles of Confederation.
Yes.
No one ever says, "Hey,
we're breaking the articles."
Let's look at the Articles of Confederation.
That's right.
And see what the law is." And these people here, they saw a transformation in government as well. They saw the Roman Republic transformed into the Roman Empire.
Right.
Two totally different systems of government.
Mm-hmm.
And so they knew that there was a former law and there is a new law. And I don't know why even today we still have a problem with that.
Yes, and that's right. When you convert to a new law, like the Articles of Confederation to the Declaration or to the Bill of Rights or those things, the Constitution, right? That no one goes to the old one, the Articles of Confederation, and says, well, let's see what that said. It doesn't matter anymore. That's annulled. We might learn some things from it, but it's annulled. And so it's the same concept here. It's the annulling of the former commandments because it's weaknesses and unprofitableness. Now, when he describes here weakness, it's the idea of it's without strength is what that word means. It lacks some kind of strength. And so, for example, in chapter 9 and verse 4, no, that's not right. Chapter 9 and, let's see here. Chapter 10 and verse 4, that's what I'm looking for. In chapter 10 and verse 4, he says, it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could truly take away sins. Right? This is the weakness of the old law. It rolls those sins forward. But why did they have the Day of Atonement once a year? They had to roll the sins forward some more. And so from the first Day of Atonement until the last Day of Atonement, they were still rolling those original sins and every one that was accrued after that forward. Basically, they're rolling God's punishment forward so that they don't have to face it today, year by year. It couldn't truly take away our sins. And then he also says that it's unprofitable. That's the idea of it can't truly help. It's without help. And so chapter 8 and verse 7, he says, if that first covenant had been faultless, no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault, now who did God find fault with? Finding fault with them. It's not that the law of Moses, God made the law of Moses. It's perfect for what it's made for, but they couldn't keep it. They couldn't be perfect under it. And so it couldn't truly help them reach the perfection, the completion that we are supposed to have. And so that's why he says it's weak and unprofitable. For the law made nothing perfect. Right? The law did not get anyone to the maturity that they're supposed to be at. On the other hand, there's the bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. All right, now that phrase, draw near to God, when you talk about the priesthood, that's very important, because when could they truly draw near to God? On the Day of Atonement. One man, one day a year, could enter the Holy of Holies. He's saying, why is our covenant better? Because we have a better hope, right? We can receive the true forgiveness of sins eternally, and because we can get even closer to God than really even the high priest could back then, because we have a different high priest. And so, starting in verse 20, he's going to continue to prove why is Jesus the better covenant. Inasmuch as he was not made a priest without an oath, for they have become priests without an oath. God called them to it, right? He anointed them priest, but he never swore Aaron will be a priest forever, right? He never made that kind of promise. You remember in chapter 6 when he said God wanted to show us, he desired to show us how much he's trustworthy. And so 1, he cannot lie. And 2, he swore to Abraham. Right? Well, look back at verse 17. It doesn't say it in verse 17, but it does say it back in Psalm 110. He says, I have sworn, or here, it'll be in verse 21. Yeah, just keep reading. That's usually the way it works with the Bible. But when he with an oath by him said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. He told Aaron to be priest. When God says something, he does not lie. That's binding. But he double wants us to understand Jesus is a priest because he swore it. I will not relent. This will not change. He will be a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. By so much more, Jesus has become a surety of a better covenant, right? He's the guarantee. Jesus is the evidence that we have a better covenant. And step 1, he says, because he swore it would happen. He never did that for Aaron. Next, verse 23. Also, there were many priests because they were prevented by death from continuing. Right? Here's one of the weaknesses of the old covenant. Aaron died, and then Eleazar took over, and Eleazar died, and then Phinehas took over, and then Phinehas died. Did they always have a good high priest? No. Sometimes they had wicked, terrible high priests. Do y'all remember Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and all the things they did? They were having inappropriate relationships with women in the tabernacle. They were stealing the fat which belongs to the Lord. Only God should have the fat. They took it for themselves, right? And God brought judgment down upon them because they were wicked priests. And there's lots of examples like that.
How wicked were they that day when he was writing this?
And in this time, very likely they had a high priest who was appointed by the Roman government and maybe wasn't even related to Aaron at this point. That was very common. And so, that's a good point. But verse 24, he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Right? If you never die, and this is what Sarah was getting at earlier, an endless genealogy, or he doesn't need a genealogy. If you never die, then you can just keep on being priest. And remember what he says about Christ in Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 8. Jesus Christ is the same today and yesterday and forever. His character doesn't change. And so if he was a good high priest when this was written, he is still a faithful and good high priest today. And so he's able to save us to the uttermost, right? He's able to do everything in his power to get us to eternity, to save us, and he does. He does everything in his power to save us. He's always right there. He never nods off and forgets to make intercession for us. He's never like in the bathroom when we go to the temple to make some kind of to seek out God's help. I'm sorry, I was busy, or he never makes mistakes, and he's always just right there doing his job to the uttermost completely. And so he says in verse 26, for such a high priest was fitting for us, because he is holy, he's harmless, he's undefiled, he's separate from sinners, he's become higher than the heavens. Right? This is his character. This is what makes him the perfect, eternal high priest. He's holy. That's the idea of he's completely committed to the cause. Right? He never has doubts and moments where he's like, well, I don't know if I really want to do this anymore. Right? This is his job, and he does it to the fullest. It says that he is harmless. Right? Nothing that Jesus does would ever harm our ability to be saved or to get closer to God. Everything he does, even discipline, and Hebrews 12 will describe that, even when he disciplines us, that's to get us closer to God. Never does he do something that, that rubbed me the wrong way, you made a mistake and it moved me further from God. Everything he does is to get us closer to God. He is undefiled, right? He's the spotless lamb. He's the lamb without any kind of mark. He is perfect. He's separate from sinners. Now we know when Jesus was on earth, he spent time with sinners. He was trying to save them. This is the idea that he's uninfluenced by sin. Right? There's no peer pressure that he's listening to, like some of the high priests in the Old Testament did. No peer pressure that's going to lead him to do something that he shouldn't do. Right? Uninfluenced by that kind of sin. And it says he's become higher than the heavens. Now, this goes back to Psalm 110. Right? It says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit here at my right hand until your enemies become your footstool. Right? He has the highest position of anybody. Part of this is important, though, when he says this, because who are they expecting to come? Who are the Jews expecting to come save them at this time? Yeah, an earthly, specifically, they're waiting on an angel. They think a Messiah angel is going to come save them at this time. And they believed that the angels had kind of a hierarchy, and that if you could get to know the different angels in their hierarchy, you could get closer and closer to God. Right? And he is saying, skip the hierarchy, right? Who do you have access to? The highest one, right? Not even an angel, he's God-man. You have access to the man who is God, who is higher than any angel. And so you don't need to go through angels to get to God. Skip all of that and go straight through to God through Jesus. He's higher than anybody. Verse 27, he says, who does not need daily, as those high priests, right, the Levites, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins and then for the people's. That's what they had to do. They had to get up every morning and they had to offer a sacrifice for their own sins, because the Levites, Aaron's descendants, were not perfect. And then they had to offer sacrifices for everybody else, and they had to do it every day, because that just rolled the punishment forward. It didn't take away their sins. But it says he did once for all when he offered up himself. How many times does Christ have to make that sacrifice? One time. And he's not just sacrificing bulls. He sacrificed himself. And he did it one time, and he never has to make a sacrifice again, because he's not going to sin. He's not going to err. So there's no more need to make that sacrifice. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weaknesses, but the word of the oath, right? That's when he swore, a priest forever. The word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints the Son who has been perfected forever. Right? It picked the man God, who can do the job perfectly. The law picked people who are not perfect and who often screwed it up. And so at the end of the day, who do you really want to submit to? Would you rather be in the Jerusalem temple, submitting to these men who mess it up and who are not perfect? Or do you want to submit to Jesus Christ, our high priest, under a different order, who never fails and always does his job perfectly? And that's kind of the big idea of chapter 7. All right, we will wrap it up there. Any last thoughts or comments?
So they messed up again. They misunderstood.
They misunderstood
the
again.
prophecy.
Yeah, they just kept trying to make it about an earthly kingdom, And it was Jesus always said, my kingdom is not of this world, it's a spiritual kingdom. So all right, thank you very much, and we'll pick up in chapter 8 next week.